So today we're going to learn about our immune system and how we have different lines of defense to keep us, first of all, from allowing pathogens to enter our body, and then if the pathogens get in, how we fight them off to bring us back to a state of health. So first of all, we should probably talk about what a pathogen is. A pathogen is an organism that causes disease. And there are all kinds of different pathogens. The first type of pathogen we'll talk about are viruses. They're the most simplistic ones, but they are really unique looking because they have all these really interesting, like alien type appearances. Viruses are special because in some cases they can't even be considered living things because all they consist of is a piece of DNA or RNA wrapped in a protein coat. So they have no ability to divide on their own, and the only way they can survive is by living in a host and using the host machinery to take care of themselves. Viruses can be vast and varied, and they can mutate quite easily because they keep inserting their DNA or RNA into our own, and mutations can build up. So some examples of viruses would be the flu, so influenza, a cold, rhinovirus, chickenpox, varicella, and polio, and the list can go on. Something I'd like to add right here about viruses, and we'll talk about again later, is that we cannot fight viruses with antibiotics. So if we go to the doctor and get antibiotics when we have a cold, it's not going to do any good because a cold is a virus, not a bacterial infection, and antibiotics only kill bacteria. Our next type of pathogen are fungi. Fungi belong to their very own kingdom. They have eukaryotic cells, so medications that would treat a fungal infection could also harm us. So we have to be careful about the treatment. A lot of the treatments would be topical, so you would put it on the affected region rather than ingest it. So some examples of fungal infections would be like toenail fungus, athlete's foot, different types of yeast infections, so vaginal yeast infections. A really weirdly named fungal infection is called ringworm. It's not a worm at all, it's actually a fungal infection. Our next type of pathogen would be bacteria. So bacteria are pretty simplistic organisms. Again, they belong to their own kingdom too. They are made of prokaryotic cells, and they're single-celled organisms. We can fight these infections with antibiotics, but unfortunately, through the overusage of antibiotics and by not taking antibiotics properly, many bacteria have developed a resistance to antibiotics, and it's becoming trickier and trickier to fight these types of infections. So some examples of bacterial infections would be tuberculosis or TB, E. coli, which you've probably heard about in the news as a source of food poisoning. Salmonella would be another type of bacterial infection that would be a food poisoning. Botulism, which is pretty nasty, also can be ingested through food and can actually cause some weird paralysis stuff, not really good. Tetanus. We're all familiar with getting a tetanus shot, so protecting us against that pathogen is good too, because it too has another name called lockjaw, which is again another paralysis type disease. You don't want to get tetanus. Our next type of pathogen are called protozoa. They are eukaryotic cells, but very simple organisms again. An example of a protozoan would be amoeba. And amoeba can cause something called amoeboid dysentery. So if you drink untreated water that have amoeba living in them, you could have unpleasant diarrhea and could even, through dehydration, die. The other type of protozoan that I'd like you to be aware of would be Plasmodium, which is carried through mosquitoes that can bite us and then transfer a disease known as malaria. Malaria is not seen in our region of the world, but in certain parts of tropical regions, so in sub-Saharan Africa and some of the tropical regions, even Central and South America, we can see malaria, and malaria can cause some very devastating effects. More people are infected with malaria than some of the other diseases that we're really frightened about, like such as Ebola and some of these really infectious diseases. But malaria is very persistent and widespread. So it is actually something that we should really be concentrating efforts into fighting and eradicating from the planet. So the final type of pathogen we'll talk about are worms. And there are all kinds of different types of worms. There's flatworms like planaria, which are found here, and flukes as well, which can live in your liver and other places in your body. There's roundworms, which are found over here. Roundworms can cause diseases like elephantitis, so they actually block up like your lymphatic system, and you can have weird swellings throughout your body. Not good to have roundworms. You can even get segmented worms, like flat segmented worms, known as tapeworms. They're not so pleasant to get either. So all kinds of different types of diseases that you can get from worms. So now we're going to talk about modes of transmission for pathogens. So transmission is just the definition of how we pass the pathogen from one organism to another. So it could be a person-to-person contact, or it could be animal to human transmission as well, or human to animal can work that way as well. So some examples of airborne pathogens would be the common cold, measles, pneumonia, mumps, and tuberculosis. Most of these pathogens are pretty much rare these days, but some of them are making a comeback, such as measles and mumps. Those are things that we vaccinate against, but because more and more people are choosing not to vaccinate, we're losing the herd immunity that we would enjoy if we had more people in the population vaccinated. So we are actually becoming more and more at risk of contracting some of these diseases we had pretty much erased from our vocabulary. So our next mode of transmission would be waterborne transmission. So this one is pretty self-explanatory. What happens is you drink contaminated water, travels through your digestive system, and it gets absorbed, and when that happens you absorb the pathogen as well. So some examples of some pretty well-known waterborne pathogens would be, first of all, cholera. Cholera used to cause widespread death when people drank untreated water, and it still is a major concern after natural disasters because often the water treatment system has failed now because of whatever disaster it's been, and there's no access to clean water, so fecal matter is going into the waterway and people are drinking it and they can develop cholera, and many people could die. So one of the big things is to get clean water to people in disaster areas or even places where there's war and whatnot, so that people can not die from cholera. Another one that's a little bit closer would be beaver fever. So basically beavers and other rodents will release their waste into ponds and lakes, and then we drink that water, even unwittingly. It might not even be intentionally in drinking the water, but if you're swimming in the lake and you even ingest a little bit just by swimming, or brushing your teeth with untreated water, you can develop beaver fever, which can cause, some unpleasant symptoms, but it usually isn't terribly deadly. Our next mode of transmission is also pretty self-explanatory. It's foodborne illness. So what happens is you eat contaminated food, you break it down, you digest it, but when you're doing that, you're ingesting a pathogen, and then you absorb it into your bloodstream through your intestines. So some examples of foodborne illnesses would be Escherichia coli or E. coli. often is found in contaminated meat. Salmonella and botulism are also examples of foodborne illnesses that would cause food poisoning. One thing about food poisoning that's interesting is it's not so much the meat that sometimes is causing these large outbreaks of food poisoning, it's cross contamination. So improper handling of food, so improper cooking of foods, of meats and so on, true, but sometimes not preparing foods properly and transferring a pathogen from meat to, say, a vegetable that you aren't cooking as much, or you're eating it raw, and then also the change in surface area. So if there's a large surface area on the type of food, it can cause a mass production of the pathogen. So like bean sprouts are often an example of something that it causes food borne illness, and hamburger meat, because you grind it all up, so you're mixing the bacteria everywhere and giving it lots of surfaces to grow on. So those are all examples of how foodborne illness can be spread. Our next mode of transmission is insect-borne transmission, and in this case, an insect that has a pathogen within it. So it could be Plasmodium in the case of malaria. It comes and it bites us. It injects the pathogen directly into our bloodstream, infecting us. So some examples of insect-borne illnesses would be malaria, which we've talked about before. Another one is West Nile virus, which it can be carried by mosquitoes in our region, so we're always monitoring and on the lookout for West Nile. And then one that's made news in the last few years is Zika. Zika is also carried by mosquitoes and is especially of concern to pregnant women, because women infected with Zika while pregnant can have a high risk of developing babies with microcephaly, so abnormally small brains, which is quite concerning. Our next mode of transmission is through direct contact. So that would be contact with skin or saliva. Associated with that would be indirect contact, so somebody touching a surface and then you coming shortly after and touching the same surface. Not all pathogens live off the body for very long periods of time, so not all things are transmitted through indirect contact. But some examples of direct contact transmission would be ringworm, which we talked about before. It's a fungal infection, so it can be passed from person to person. Herpes, the common cold sore, can be transmitted through direct contact. Our final mode of transmission is sexually transmitted diseases. These are actually a special type of direct contact transmission. Sexually transmitted diseases are mainly transferred through vaginal, anal, and oral sex, but also can be transmitted through blood products, but that's not common. In fact, it doesn't happen anymore, but did before we had blood screening processes in place. Through unclean needles, so usually through intravenous drug users, not reusing needles, that would be a problem. And then finally, from mother to baby during childbirth. Some of the main sexually transmitted diseases, and there are a lot, would be HIV, so human immunodeficiency virus, which actually is a virus that attacks our immune system and slowly over time prevents us from being able to fight infections. Once the immune system is pretty much eradicated, the patient or the person is said to have AIDS, which is acquired immunodeficiency syndrome. Herpes, which we talked about before, chlamydia, syphilis, hepatitis A, B, and C, human papillomavirus or HPV, which we now vaccinate against in teenage girls or preteen girls, but not yet for males. And then finally, gonorrhea.